He was framed by a wealthy cattle baron, left alone against an entire town that saw him as nothing more than a savage. But this mob justice would not only decide his fate, but would also bring down the entire power structure, exposing the town's dirty secrets thanks to the intervention of its most invisible resident. This is the story of how quiet strength defeated loud cruelty. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, striking the anvil of the baked earth until the very air shimmered with heat. Dust, as fine and pale as bone meal, coated every surface, stirred into choking clouds by any hint of movement. It was into this furnace that they dragged Silas. He was a man who seemed less a resident of the world and more a feature of the landscape, his skin tanned to the color of weathered leather, and his eyes holding the distant, unblinking patience of the mountains that were his home. Two of Bartholomew Cain's men, their silver-plated badges gleaming with a purchased authority, held his arms. Their grip was bruising, intended to humiliate, but Silas offered no resistance. He moved with a grudging economy, his body a fortress of stoicism, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of a struggle. To fight them here, in their world of noise and lies, would be a pointless waste of spirit. Bartholomew Cain observed the scene from the shaded porch of the land office, a structure he owned, just as he owned the general store, the livery, and the allegiance of the sheriff. He was a man of considerable size, his prosperity evident in the fine wool suit that was so ill-suited to the climate, a dark bloom of sweat staining the fabric between his shoulder blades. He let the mountain man be dragged to the center of the square before he raised a thick, bejeweled hand and pointed. "Behold the savage who plagues our hard-working community," his voice boomed, a practiced instrument of command. "This is the thief who drove off a dozen of my finest cattle, leaving a trail of disrespect for our laws. I saw him with my own eyes." The accusation, sharp and certain, sliced through the thick air. The assembled townspeople, shopkeepers weary of debt, ranchers fearful of drought, laborers nursing grievances, muttered their assent. Their lives were hard, and Cain had given their hardship a face and a name. For the first time since being brought into the town, Silas lifted his head fully. His gaze was not defiant, but appraising. It swept over the hostile faces, seeing not a mob of monsters, but a gathering of frightened souls, easily led and quick to anger. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Cain. When he spoke, his voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together, yet it possessed a strange carrying power. "You are a liar, Cain." It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, as simple and unadorned as a piece of granite. In the silent, brutal honesty of Silas's world, a lie was a deformity, a perversion of the natural order. He knew with a weary certainty that his words were seeds falling on barren ground. These people did not value the truth. They valued the comfort of a simple enemy. Their growl deepened, a beast awakening, ready for the blood sport their master had promised. Silas, in his silence and strange integrity, was the perfect sacrifice. High above the unfolding drama, in the quiet, orderly sanctuary of her second-story dressmaking shop, Alara watched. The air in her room smelled of fresh linen, beeswax, and the faint metallic scent of her shears. Everything had its place. Bolts of calico and silk were stacked in precise columns of color. Jars of buttons were sorted by size and material, and a half-finished wedding dress stood on its mannequin like a pale ghost, its intricate lacework a map of her patience. This world of meticulous control was her defense against the chaotic, unpredictable world below. For years, she had been a part of Redemption Gulch's scenery, as unremarkable as a fence post. People knew her as the quiet seamstress, but they did not know her at all, and she had long preferred it that way. Invisibility was a form of peace. The first angry shouts had been a discordant note in the symphony of the afternoon drawing her to the window. Now she stood partially concealed by the curtain, her hands resting on the sun-warmed sill, her gaze missing nothing. She saw how Cain's gestures were just a little too broad, a little too theatrical. She noted the way Sheriff Cobb kept wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers, his eyes darting everywhere, except toward the prisoner. She dissected the crowd, identifying the true believers, the reluctant followers, and the morbidly curious. Her calm was not detachment. It was focus. It was the same intense concentration she brought to a difficult stitch, a habit of mind cultivated over a lifetime of quiet observation. While the town was being swept up in a tide of righteous fury, Alara was examining the currents beneath the surface. Her mind went back 2 nights. She had been working late, the glow of her lamp a lone star in the town's darkness. She remembered the distinct sound of a small herd being driven, not along the main road but on the disused eastern trail. Peering out, she had clearly seen 2 of Kane's most trusted ranch hands guiding the animals away from town, toward the railhead. It was a strange time and a strange direction for moving cattle. At the time, it had been a minor puzzle, a detail to be filed away. Now, that detail clicked into place with sickening clarity. As she watched them shove Silas toward the center of the square, the puzzle pieces formed a grim picture. A cold resolve, sharp and unyielding as one of her sewing needles began to form deep within her. The time for being invisible was coming to an end. Kane let the animalistic growl of the crowd sustain itself, pacing the porch like a showman working his audience. The circuit judge, "He won't be through these parts for another month." "A month," he repeated, his voice filled with scorn. "Are we to house and feed this parasite? Let him sit in our jail, a constant reminder of his crime, a threat to the very fabric of our society." He posed the questions not to be answered, but to stoke their impatience and fear. "No. We are a community of action. We live by a harder code, a Western code. We deliver our own justice, swift, clear, and final. We will send a message today that echoes from these hills to the plains. The people of Redemption Gulch protect their own." The roar that answered him was thunderous, a unified wave of consent that washed away any lingering civility. This was the moment Kane had engineered. The law was not a principle to him. It was a tool, and when it was inconvenient, it was to be discarded. Sheriff Cobb, a man whose spine had long ago been dissolved by alcohol and compromise, made a final pathetic gesture of officialdom. "Now, Bartholomew," he began, "we should at least hold a formal hearing." Kane cut him off with a look of such withering contempt that Cobb physically recoiled, his words dying in his throat. "We are the hearing, Sheriff," Kane announced to the crowd, "and we have reached our verdict." With that, the die was cast. A few of Kane's men turned toward Gunner, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man whose physical strength was offset by a gentle, hesitant nature. He looked reluctant, his eyes pleading for someone to stop this, but under the pressure of a dozen gazes he slowly went to his smithy. He returned with a hammer and a grim look on his face. Men began tearing planks from the porch of the half-built general store. The rhythmic, brutal sound of a hammer striking nails became the town's heartbeat. A heavy crossbeam was hoisted into place. Another man appeared with a length of thick, stiff rope and began expertly fashioning a hangman's knot, his fingers moving with a practiced, obscene nonchalance. The entire affair took on a terrifying momentum, a piece of grim machinery assembled by many hands, all of which could later claim they were only responsible for a single part. The path from the street to the makeshift gallows was short, but for Silas, it felt like a journey across a desolate landscape. Kane's men shoved him forward, but he moved with a solid, rooted grace, his boots meeting the earth with a finality that unnerved his captors. He refused to be herded like a panicked animal. There was no terror in his eyes for the crowd to feast upon, only a profound and weary contempt. He saw them not as individuals, but as a single entity, a creature with many mouths and no mind, momentarily powerful but ultimately weak, for its strength was borrowed from the man who fed it lies. He was a creature of the mountains, a place of harsh truths and stark beauty, and this dusty, clamorous town was a more alien environment than any wilderness he had ever faced. They forced him onto a large packing crate that served as the platform, the rough sawn wood unsteady beneath his feet. The noose, a crude circle of braided hemp, dangled beside his head, casting a small dancing shadow on his cheek. He looked out at them then, at the sun-scorched, hate-filled faces, and he felt a pang of something that was not fear, but a deep, sorrowful pity. They thought this act would make them safer, stronger. He knew it would only hollow them out, leaving a rot of shame that would fester for years. His gaze drifted past them to the distant hazy peaks of the mountains, his true home. He brought his attention back to the square, his eyes finding and locking onto Bartholomew Cain's triumphant smirk. It was the smugness, the absolute certainty of his own righteousness that Silas could not abide. It was then he chose to speak, his quiet voice cutting through the thick anticipation. "Your rope," he said, his words measured and clear, "won't make your lie the truth." The statement was a rock thrown into the placid surface of their certainty. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a plea. It was a final, unassailable fact. Cain's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of raw fury. The mountain man was supposed to be broken, but he stood on the precipice of death and judged his executioner. In the crowd, the blacksmith Gunnar stopped his hammering, and Finn, the saloon owner, suddenly found the bottom of his glass very interesting. The seed of doubt, small and fragile, had been planted. From her window, Ilara saw the subtle shift as clearly as if it were a change in the weather. She saw Gunnar's hands, powerful enough to bend iron, hesitate on the handle of his hammer. She saw Finn, the saloon owner, turn away from the spectacle, his shoulders slumping. She saw a few women at the back of the crowd pull their shawls tighter, their expressions turning from vindictive to uncertain. It was not a rebellion, not even a protest, but it was a crack in the dam of their collective rage. Silas's words had reminded them that there was a truth independent of their desires, a reality that could not be erased by a rope. They feared Cain's power, but they were beginning to fear the judgment of their own conscience even more. This was the fulcrum on which the day would turn. Ilara understood the psychology of the herd. They were bound by a shared narrative, and Cain was its author. But a competing narrative, one of integrity and quiet truth, had just been introduced. It was not strong enough to stand on its own. It needed a champion. It needed a force more tangible than a condemned man's last words. She felt the familiar tremor begin in her hands, a physical manifestation of the war within her. For her entire adult life, she had built a fortress of anonymity around herself. It was safe. It was quiet. To act now was to tear down that fortress brick by brick, to expose herself to the very world she had so carefully hidden from. She pressed her palms flat against the smooth, cool surface of her cutting table, drawing strength from its solidity. She thought of her father, Judge Alistair Monroe. She pictured him in his courtroom, his face stern but his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering belief in the sanctity of the law. "The law is all that separates us from the animals," Ilara, he had written in his last letter. "It is a fragile shield, and it is worthless if good people will not hold it up against the storm." The memory was a clarion call. Her fear was real, but the alternative, to stand by and watch this grotesque parody of justice unfold, was unthinkable. Her trembling stopped. She clenched her hand into a fist, the knuckles white. The shield needed to be raised. The flicker of doubt in the crowd was a challenge Cain could not ignore. His authority depended on unwavering momentum. "Enough of this nonsense," he bellowed, his voice a whip crack of command that jolted the hesitant back into line. "Get on with it." At his signal, the hangman, a gaunt man with soulless eyes, grabbed the noose. He approached Silas with a grim purpose, pulling the loop wide and dropping it over his head. The rope was rough and stiff, smelling of dust and something vaguely sour. It settled heavily on Silas's shoulders before the hangman cinched it tight around his neck. Silas stood perfectly still, his breathing even, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had faced death before, in the form of blizzards, rockslides, and starving predators. This was just another form, uglier and more dishonest, but no less final. To reassert his dominance and transform the grim affair back into a righteous spectacle, Cain climbed onto a large water barrel. From this makeshift stage he addressed his audience, his voice filled with a fraudulent solemnity. "We stand here today not as vigilantes, but as protectors of civilization," he declared, one hand placed over his heart. "We are drawing a line in this dust, a line that tells the lawless that they cannot prey upon us with impunity. This is a solemn duty, a heavy burden we bear for the sake of order and prosperity." The words were hollow, but delivered with such conviction that they once again began to sway the crowd, lulling their nascent consciences back to sleep. The tension in the square became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on everyone, stealing the air from their lungs. The hangman had done his work. He stepped back, his eyes fixed on Cain, waiting for the signal. Cain let the moment stretch, prolonging his power, savoring the feeling of holding a man's life in his hands. He looked at Silas, expecting to see fear, but found nothing but a calm, unnerving emptiness. Annoyed, Cain raised his right hand high. The crowd leaned forward as one. A woman sobbed quietly. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Cain's raised hand and the taut rope. The silence was absolute, a vacuum waiting for the fall. Into that vacuum, a voice spoke. "Stop." It was not a shout, but it sliced through the silence with the force of a physical blow. The word was clear, perfectly enunciated, and carried an unmistakable weight of command. For a disoriented moment, no one could locate the source. Then, the crowd began to stir, heads turning, bodies shifting. A path was cleared, not by force, but as if by an invisible wave of pressure. And down that path, from the doorway of the dressmaker's shop, walked Elara. The transformation was absolute. The woman who walked toward the gallows was not the quiet, deferential seamstress they thought they knew. Her usual stoop was gone, replaced by a ramrod-straight posture. She had her hair pulled back severely, accentuating the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. Her simple dress, usually a uniform of invisibility, now seemed a garment of severe purpose. But the real change was in her eyes. They were not downcast. They were level, blazing with a cold, focused fire, and they were fixed on Bartholomew Cain. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace that was more intimidating than any charge. The townspeople simply stared, their mouths agape. It was as if a statue had come to life and was now issuing orders. The hangman froze, his hand dropping to his side. Sheriff Cobb looked from Elara to Cain, his face a mask of utter confusion. Cain, still perched on his barrel, lowered his hand, his expression of triumph curdling into one of pure venomous shock. Elara came to a halt directly in front of the platform, a small, unmovable object standing in the path of an execution. She ignored Silas completely. Her business was with the man on the barrel. "Get down from there, Mr. Cain," she said, her voice quiet but leaving no room for negotiation. "This proceeding is over." Bartholomew Cain stared down at Elara, his mind struggling to process this impossible defiance. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, woman?" "I gave an order. This is town business." His voice was a menacing rumble, but it was edged with a new, uncertain quaver. The absolute control he had wielded just moments before was slipping from his grasp. "This is not town business. It is a crime," Elara replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. She reached into a hidden pocket of her dress and withdrew a single sheet of paper folded neatly. The crowd watched, mesmerized as she unfolded it. It was thick, creamy stationery, covered in a bold, authoritative script. At the bottom was a large, ornate seal of dark red wax. "This is a judicial injunction issued by the Territorial Court of Judge Alistair Monroe." She held the paper up, turning it slowly so that everyone could see the official seal. "It expressly forbids any and all acts of popular justice or extrajudicial punishment within this jurisdiction. It declares any such act to be murder under the law." A wave of confused murmuring swept through the crowd. They were simple folk. The legal language was foreign to them, but the name was not. Judge Monroe. His name was a synonym for an unbending, almost terrifying devotion to the letter of the law. Cain scoffed, a desperate, hollow sound. "And how did a seamstress come by such a document?" "It's a fake." He said it with conviction, but his eyes betrayed his panic. Elara lowered the paper and looked directly at him. She let the silence stretch for a heartbeat before delivering the final, catastrophic blow. "He gave it to me this morning," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "He is, after all, my father." The gasp from the crowd was a single, unified sound of disbelief. The world had just tilted on its axis. The quiet gray woman they had ignored for years was not a mouse. She was the daughter of a lion. The revelation struck the square with the force of a physical impact, leaving a stunned, ringing silence in its wake. Bartholomew Cain stood as if turned to stone, the injunction clutched in his trembling hand. In a matter of seconds, his perfect theater of power had been dismantled by the one person he had never even considered a player. But years of bullying and intimidation were a hard habit to break. Rage, raw and desperate, flooded his system, chasing out the fear. He would not be beaten. "A lie!" he roared, his voice hoarse with fury. He theatrically crumpled the injunction into a ball and hurled it into the dust, an act of open rebellion against the very concept of a law beyond his own will. "She is a liar, a mad woman. Do you truly believe this fantasy, that the great Judge Monroe would hide his daughter away in a dusty town like this to sew dresses? It's absurd." He began to pace, his mind racing, searching for a way to claw back his authority. He turned his venom on Alara herself. "Look at her. She's trying to save her lover. This mountain savage has bewitched her with his wilderness ways." He jabbed a finger at the crowd, trying to reignite their collective paranoia. "Are you sheep? Will you let this spinster and her forged paper make fools of you? We had him. We had justice in our grasp. She is the one breaking the law by interfering with the will of the people." He strode toward Alara until he was towering over her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He was no longer a leader. He was a cornered animal, biting and clawing with his last reserves of fury. He was betting everything on the hope that their fear of chaos was greater than their respect for a distant, unseen judge. He was betting that their loyalty to him, their master, was stronger than the truth. Alara did not flinch. She stood her ground, letting Cain's storm of rage break against the shores of her composure. When his shouting subsided into ragged, heavy breaths, she spoke again, her voice the calm center of the hurricane. "Your theatrics are impressive, Mr. Cain, but they are empty. Let us speak of things that are not empty. Let us speak of evidence." She turned slightly, including the captivated townspeople in her address, transforming them from a mob into a jury. "You said you saw Silas drive the cattle north into the mountains," she began, her voice methodical. "But 2 nights ago, just after 11, I saw 2 of your ranch hands. I believe it was Henderson and Clark, driving about a dozen cattle east on the old Blackston Trail. Were they acting under your orders?" She posed the question gently, but it landed like a physical blow. Cain sputtered. That's a different matter. A separate transaction." "Is it?" Alara pressed, her logic relentless. "What about the tracks? Sheriff, did you or any of your men follow the trail from Mr. Cain's land?" The sheriff flushed, looking at his boots. "Well, ma'am, things happened so fast." Alara nodded. "Of course. Let me ask another question. Why is it that the very land Silas refuses to sell you is the only piece of property that blocks your direct access to the river for grazing? An inconvenience that would vanish if he were, for example, permanently removed. The pieces were not just clicking into place. They were forming a damning mosaic. She had taken his simple story of theft and exposed it as a complex, greedy conspiracy. The crowd was no longer looking at Silas. They were all looking at Cain, and for the first time, they were seeing the tyrant, not the protector. The spell was broken. The collective fury that Cain had so expertly cultivated now curdled into suspicion and shame. The people looked at the crude gallows, at the rope, at the man who stood silently beneath it, and they saw not an act of justice, but the grim architecture of a murder they had almost committed. The whispers started at the edge of the crowd and grew into a low, angry murmur, a tide of resentment turning against its former master. The power Cain had held over them was an illusion, and Alara, with her quiet facts, had been the one to pull back the curtain. Just then, a new sound intruded, the steady, rhythmic beat of approaching hooves. A column of riders crested the small rise at the edge of town. They were not a ragtag posse, but 5 territorial marshals, moving with a disciplined single-mindedness. They were clad in dusters, their badges catching the harsh sunlight, their faces set in grim professional lines. They rode directly into the center of the square, their presence instantly rendering the local authority, in the form of Sheriff Cobb, completely irrelevant. Their leader, a formidable man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, surveyed the scene with a practiced, all-encompassing gaze. His eyes took in the gallows, the prisoner, the stunned crowd, and finally settled on Alara. He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling in the sudden silence. He walked toward her, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a respectful baritone. "Your father sent his regards." "And us. He said you might have need of official assistance in a local matter." The marshal's words were the final, irrefutable confirmation of everything. The last vestiges of Kane's authority crumbled to dust. Two of the other marshals dismounted, their movements economical and assured. They walked toward Bartholomew Kane, who seemed to visibly deflate, the rage draining out of him to be replaced by the sallow, clammy look of fear. He offered no resistance as they bound his hands behind his back, his reign over Redemption Gulch ending not with a bang, but with the quiet metallic click of handcuffs. With Kane secured, one of the marshals ascended the platform. He produced a large knife, and with a single decisive slash, severed the rope around Silas's neck. The noose fell away into the dust. Silas stood there for a moment, rubbing the angry red welt on his skin, his eyes still fixed on Alara. He stepped down from the crate, his movements as unhurried as ever, and walked to the center of the square where she stood. The entire town watched. Silent witnesses to this quiet conclusion, they stood facing one another, two solitary islands in a sea of communal shame. He, a man who had fled the corruptions of society. She, a woman who had hidden within them. There was no need for words. A simple thank you would have been an insult, a trivial payment for the gift of his life. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the vast, silent respect of the mountains he called home. He gave a slow, formal nod, an acknowledgement of her strength, a recognition of a spirit as unyielding as his own. She returned the nod, a silent acceptance of their strange, momentary alliance, an understanding that passed between two people who knew the profound weight of solitude. Without a further glance at the town or its humbled citizens, Silas turned and walked toward the sheriff's office. He emerged a moment later with his rifle and a small canvas pack. He settled them on his shoulder, and with a steady, ground-eating stride, he began his journey back to the wilderness. He did not look back. He was a creature of stone and sky, and he was returning to his element. Alara watched until his figure was a small speck dissolving into the heat haze. She then turned and surveyed the townspeople. They looked back at her with a new expression, a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. The invisible seamstress was gone forever. In her place stood the judge's daughter, a quiet woman who had held up the fragile shield of the law and, in doing so, had become the unassailable conscience of Redemption Gulch.